In the 1980s, childhood had a different texture than it does today. We didn't have smartphones, tablets, or endless streaming services to fill our hours. Instead, our entertainment sprouted from imagination and adventure, particularly for those of us fortunate enough to grow up in small towns where the boundary between civilization and wilderness was delightfully blurry. Our parents' constant refrain of "go outside and play" wasn't a punishment, but an invitation to endless possibilities. In our community, like many similar rural American towns of that era, the culture revolved heavily around outdoor activities: hunting, fishing, and especially motorized recreation. Almost every kid had some form of ATV or dirt bike, the mechanical horses of our generation. These weren't just vehicles, they were passports to adventure, keys to a kingdom of dirt trails and forgotten places that adults rarely ventured. My own initiation into this world came at age 7, through a chance encounter with destiny in the form of a Yamaha YZ80 dirt bike. I still remember the moment perfectly. The bike propped up on its stand along the highway, gleaming in the summer sun like some mechanical promise of adventure. It was a racing bike, all power and purpose, far more machine than any 7-year-old should probably handle. But in that moment, I was consumed by the kind of pure, focused desire that only children can truly experience. My father, being the voice of reason and responsibility, initially resisted. He saw what I couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge: that a high-powered racing bike might be a bit much for a child who still needed help tying his shoes. But I launched a campaign of persuasion that would have made professional lobbyists proud. For weeks, I worked every angle, employed every tactic in the child's arsenal of convince: pleading, promising, bargaining, and the most effective weapon of all: persistent, unrelenting enthusiasm. When he finally relented, I experienced joy in its purest form. The reality of actually riding the bike, however, provided an immediate reality check. My first attempt at mastering this mechanical beast resulted in an impressive but unintentional wheelie, followed by an equally impressive flip that probably had my father mentally calculating emergency room costs. The bike and I both survived, though my father's confidence in his decision may have been slightly dented. Learning to ride became my obsession. Our town had no shortage of open spaces, and I spent every available moment practicing, falling, getting back up, and trying again. The process of mastering the machine was gradual but deeply satisfying. Each new skill acquired, clutch control, gear shifting, weight distribution, felt like unlocking a new level of freedom. As my confidence grew, so did my radius of exploration. Word spread among my friends, as news always does in small towns, and soon I was being introduced to an entire network of trails and riding spots I hadn't known existed. After school became synonymous with dirt bike time. We'd rush home, grab our gear, and disappear into the network of trails that surrounded our town like a web. These weren't just afternoon activities. They were the building blocks of lifelong memories, the kind that get burnished golden with time. Among all our riding spots, one location held a particular mystique: Emmeline's. The name itself was a mystery. None of us knew who Emmeline was or had been, or why this particular stretch of wilderness bore her name. At its center stood an abandoned house, a structure that had been slowly returning to the earth for longer than anyone could remember. The house wasn't just a landmark, it was the heart of an elaborate network of trails that offered everything a young rider could want: challenging hills that tested your nerve, creek crossings that required precise timing, and long straightaways where you could really open up the throttle and feel the rush of speed. The trails around Emmeline's had a different character than the other riding spots in our area. They felt older somehow, more established, as if they'd been carved into the landscape by something more ancient than dirt bikes and ATVs. The forest itself seemed different there, deeper, more watchful. Even during busy afternoons when multiple riders were tearing around the trails, There were always pockets of absolute silence, places where the normal sounds of the woods would suddenly cease. While I usually rode with friends, I'd done plenty of solo runs at Emmeline's. There was something special about riding alone, a purity to the experience that you couldn't get with others around. When you're by yourself on those trails, it's just you, the bike, and whatever lurks in the shadows between the trees. At least that's how I thought about it before that day. The afternoon in question started normally enough. School had loaded me down with homework that couldn't be ignored, forcing me to delay my usual after-school ride. By the time I'd finished my assignments and gotten permission to go out, the day was already sliding toward evening. It was summer, though, which meant I still had a good 2.5 hours before darkness would become an issue. My bike didn't have lights, none of our dirt bikes did, so timing was crucial. The late hour actually added to my anticipation. There's something different about the woods in the late afternoon, when the sun starts to slip and the shadows begin to lengthen. The air gets heavier, carries sound differently. Even familiar trails take on new characteristics as the light changes and visibility starts to play tricks with your depth perception. I went through my usual pre-ride routine with practiced efficiency, checking the fuel, inspecting the chain tension, making sure everything was tight and ready. The bike had a minor issue, a broken clutch cable that my dad had ordered but hadn't arrived yet. This meant starting required a specific sequence: kickstart in neutral, give it a push, jump on, and throw it into gear. It wasn't ideal, but I'd gotten pretty good at the maneuver. Looking back now, I wonder if that mechanical limitation might have been what saved me, forcing me to become expert at quick starts. The 5-minute ride to Emmeline's was pure joy. There's nothing quite like the feeling of being on a dirt bike, especially at that age. The combination of freedom, power, and skill creates a kind of euphoria that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the trail, and the air had that perfect late summer quality, warm but not hot, with just enough moisture to keep the dust down. For the first hour, everything was normal. I had the trails to myself, which wasn't unusual for that time of day. Most kids would have already finished their riding and headed home for dinner. The solitude just made it better. No need to worry about other riders around blind corners. No pressure to show off or keep up with anyone else. Just me, the bike, and the increasingly shadowy trails. It was during a break in my riding that the first hints of something wrong began to surface. I'd been pushing hard for about an hour, taking the jumps higher and the corners faster than I probably should have, when nature called. I found myself near the old field, a clearing roughly 4 or 5 acres in size, surrounded by an ancient fence that had been slowly losing its battle with time and rust for decades. The fence posts still stood like sentinels around the perimeter, though many of the connecting sections had long since surrendered to gravity and decay. Without my bike's kickstand, a racing bike sacrifice, I had to lean it carefully against one of the sturdier fence posts. The metal was cool against my hand, with that particular texture that only years of weathering can create. As I took care of business, the first unsettling detail registered in my consciousness: the absolute silence. Now, woods are never truly silent. There's always a baseline of sound: birds calling, squirrels chittering, leaves rustling, the distant sound of water if you're near a creek. Even insects provide a constant background hum during summer months. But at that moment, standing there in the growing shadows of late afternoon, there was nothing. The silence had a weight to it, a presence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Initially, I rationalized it. I'd been riding hard after all, and the YZ80's 2-stroke engine wasn't exactly quiet. It made sense that the local wildlife might need a few minutes to resume their normal activities after the noise had stopped. But as the seconds ticked by and the silence persisted, that explanation began to feel increasingly hollow. The first sound that broke through that unnatural quiet came from about 50 or 60 yards away, a rustling in the underbrush that seemed somehow deliberate. When I looked in that direction, I saw nothing obvious, but something about the way the shadows moved between the trees seemed wrong. The rational part of my brain immediately suggested a squirrel. They were everywhere in these woods after all, but squirrels don't make shadows move like that. That's when the sensation of being watched hit me. It wasn't the vague paranoia you sometimes get in the woods when your imagination starts working overtime. This was visceral, primal, the same instinct that tells prey animals when a predator has fixed its attention on them. The feeling had a direction to it, as if I could have pointed to exactly where the watching thing was, even though I couldn't see it. The heavy knowledge of my vulnerability settled over me like a wet blanket. I was alone, at least a mile from the nearest house, with only a dirt bike that required a complicated starting procedure to escape on. The sun was getting lower, creating longer shadows between the trees, and that watching presence seemed to be growing stronger with each passing moment. As I started to move toward my bike, every childhood story about monsters in the woods suddenly felt less like fiction and more like warning. That's when I heard it, the sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Footsteps, perfectly matching my own, coming from directly behind me. The human mind has an incredible capacity for denial, especially when faced with something that shouldn't be possible. Those footsteps behind me, perfect mirrors of my own movements, triggered a rapid cascade of rationalizations. It had to be an echo, I told myself. Or maybe the sound of my own footsteps bouncing off the old fence, or one of my friends playing a prank. The alternative was too terrifying to contemplate, but each step I took was shadowed by another, and the sound wasn't coming from the fence, or the trees, or any angle that could have produced an echo. It was coming from directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck, should have seen a shadow overlapping my own in the fading sunlight. When I spun around, expecting, hoping, to catch one of my friends in the act of an elaborate prank, I found only empty air and lengthening shadows. The rational explanations crumbled away like dry leaves, leaving me alone with a truth my mind wasn't ready to accept. Something was there. Something I couldn't see but could hear with terrifying clarity. Each step I took toward my bike was accompanied by that phantom footfall. And now I could hear something else in those steps. A weight that suggested something far larger than a human, and a subtle wrongness to the rhythm that spoke of a gait that wasn't quite natural. The distance to my bike couldn't have been more than 10 feet, but it felt like miles. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew I couldn't waste the precious seconds I'd need to execute the complicated starting procedure. Without a clutch cable, I'd have to perform a precise sequence of actions. Kickstart the engine, get it moving, jump on, and shift into gear. All while whatever was behind me closed the distance. The next few moments exist in my memory with the hyper-real clarity that only pure terror can produce. I remember the exact texture of the rusted fence under my hands as I grabbed my bike, the way the fading sunlight caught the chrome of the handlebars, the smell of gasoline and oil mixed with the organic decay of the forest, and behind it all those footsteps, still matching my movements with impossible precision. I took a deep breath, gathering every scrap of courage I possessed. All those hours of practice with the broken clutch cable were about to be put to the ultimate test. I had one chance to get this right. If I stalled the bike or missed the timing on jumping on, I knew instinctively that there wouldn't be a second attempt. The sequence of actions that followed felt like they happened in slow motion, though they couldn't have taken more than a few seconds. My hands found their positions automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought was starting to freeze up with fear. The kickstart engaged with a solid thrust, the engine catching on the first try, thank God for small mercies. As I began to push the bike forward, I felt something change in the air behind me, a shift in pressure, a gathering of intent. That's when I felt it. a rush of air across my back like something had swung or swiped at me and missed by inches. The sensation wasn't just physical. It carried with it an impression of massive size and predatory purpose that bypassed my conscious mind and spoke directly to the primitive brainstem where our oldest fears reside. What happened next was pure instinct and adrenaline. I threw myself onto the bike with a desperation I'd never known before, my body moving with a coordination that fear and survival instinct had somehow perfected. The engine roared as I slammed it into gear, the back tire throwing dirt and leaves as it fought for traction on the forest floor. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought the tire might spin uselessly, leaving me stranded there with whatever was behind me. But then the rubber caught, and the bike lurched forward with enough force to nearly throw me off. I rode like I'd never ridden before. Every skill I'd developed over countless hours of practice came together in a perfect symphony of survival. The bike responded to my slightest input as if it too sensed the danger behind us. I took corners at speeds that should have sent me crashing into the trees, leaned into turns at angles that defied gravity, and somehow stayed upright through it all. Behind me, the forest seemed to come alive with movement. When I dared to glance back, something every instinct screamed against doing, I could see the trees swaying and shaking, as if something massive was moving through them. Whatever was pursuing me wasn't constrained by the trails. It was coming straight through the forest, taking the most direct route possible. The sound of breaking branches and the impossible rhythm of its movement created a terrible soundtrack to my desperate flight. The YZ80's engine screamed at a pitch I'd never heard before, as if the little bike understood that this wasn't just another afternoon ride. Each gear shift was perfect, each line through the corners exactingly precise. I rode like a professional, like my life depended on it, because I was absolutely certain that it did. The most terrifying part wasn't the speed or the danger of crashing. It was the growing certainty that whatever was chasing me was keeping pace. Despite pushing the bike to its absolute limits, despite taking risks that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, I could still hear it moving through the forest parallel to my path. The thing seemed to anticipate my route, cutting across loops in the trail to match my progress. When I finally broke out onto the main road, the transition from dirt to pavement felt like crossing some kind of boundary. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, my whole body trembling with adrenaline and exertion. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the chase had been. The normal sounds of the world, distant traffic, birds, the wind in the trees, seemed to rush back in all at once, as if someone had suddenly unmuted reality. Just as I was starting to think I might have imagined the whole thing, it came. A scream that started so low it was almost subsonic, building to a pitch that made my bones vibrate. It wasn't just loud. It was wrong in a way that defied description, like the sound of something that shouldn't exist in our world, trying to express itself through sound waves that weren't meant to carry such information. The scream seemed to go on forever, building in intensity until I could feel it in my chest cavity, like it was trying to reach inside me and stop my heart. When it finally ended, the normal sounds of the world seemed flat and artificial in comparison, as if that otherworldly cry had somehow changed the way my ears processed sound. I kicked the bike into gear and rode home as fast as I dared on the pavement, convinced that every shadow concealed whatever had chased me through Emmeline's woods. The bike that had been my pride and joy, my ticket to adventure, suddenly felt fragile and inadequate against the memory of what lurked in those trees. It would be months before I ventured back to Emmeline's, and when I did, I made sure I was never alone. The broken clutch cable was fixed, but I kept practicing those quick starts anyway, a habit born of terror that never quite left me. When my friends asked why I insisted on riding in groups, I made excuses about safety and numbers and parents' rules. How could I explain what I'd encountered? Who would believe that something had stalked me through those familiar woods, matching my steps with impossible precision before pursuing me with inhuman speed. To this day, I can't pass those trails without remembering that unearthly scream, without feeling the phantom rush of air across my back where something nearly caught me. The woods hold their secrets, and sometimes, if we're lucky, they let us escape with ours. But the memory of that day lingers like a shadow, a reminder that not all childhood adventures end with just a good story to tell. On July 3, 2020, the line between normal and nightmare blurred in ways I'm still trying to understand. I was 19 then, living in a rural area on the East Coast, where forests and swampland created a natural maze around our house. That night was supposed to be simple, just a pre-4th of July celebration at a friend's house. Instead, it became my introduction to something that exists in the spaces between shadow and substance. The evening started innocently enough. After dinner, around 9:30, I prepared for the short bike ride to my friend's house. The mundane details stand out in my memory now. Throwing on flip-flops, grabbing a flashlight, unhooking my bike from its chain. These normal actions feel significant in retrospect, like the last moments of innocence before everything changed. The road to my friend's house wound through a corridor of trees so dense their branches formed a natural tunnel overhead. Even in daylight, this stretch of road had an oppressive quality. At night, it became something else entirely, a throat of darkness that swallowed both sound and light. With my flashlight beam creating a narrow path ahead and one hand on the handlebars, I set out into the gathering dark. The whispers started so subtly I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. At first, they were like background noise, the kind of sound you might attribute to wind in leaves or your own breathing. But they grew more distinct with each turn of my bike's wheels, multiplying and surrounding me like invisible spectators. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, left, right, behind, above. Yet I couldn't make out a single word they were saying. Then came the scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you might hear at a carnival-haunted house or in a horror movie. This was primal, raw, the sound of genuine terror or agony echoing through the trees. It reminded me of descriptions I'd read of mountain lion cries, how they sometimes sound disturbingly human, but this was different. This scream carried intent, purpose, and most terrifyingly, it was getting closer. As if the scream wasn't enough to turn my blood to ice, another sound joined the nightmarish chorus: laughter. Not the warm laughter of friendship, or even the mocking laughter of bullies, but something that existed outside the spectrum of normal human emotion. It was the kind of laugh that suggests its owner has never known joy, only the cruel simulation of it. The sound seemed to chase me, getting closer with each rotation of my pedals. My legs burned with effort as I pushed harder, trying to outrace whatever was pursuing me through the darkness. The cramping in my muscles felt distant, unimportant compared to the primal need to escape. The road ahead seemed to stretch and distort, as if the very geography of the place was conspiring against me. What should have been a familiar path now felt endless, each bend in the road revealing only more darkness. When I saw a car's headlights in the distance, the brief flash of civilization through the trees, I nearly cried with relief. I pushed toward it like a drowning person swimming for shore. But just as I thought I might be reaching safety, everything changed. The whisper came again, but this time it was different. This wasn't the indistinct murmuring from before. This was clear, precise, and terrifyingly close. I felt cold breath against my ear, like winter itself was forming words. Protect your shadow. The phrase seemed to freeze the air around me, carrying weight and meaning I couldn't yet understand. When I finally arrived at my friend's house, having made the journey in record time, I tried to shake off the experience. The normal chaos of a pre-holiday celebration, Fireworks, laughter, the smell of smoke and gunpowder should have been enough to ground me back in reality. Instead, it became the backdrop for something even stranger. The incident between my friend and his younger brother seemed minor at first, the kind of scuffle siblings often have. But when their father's hand connected with my friend's face, something shifted in the fabric of reality. The snap of fingers by my ear was like a signal, a cue in some cosmic performance I hadn't known I was part of. The whispered words that followed turned my blood to ice. The shadow is now ours. Thank you for the treasure. In that moment, I realized I was witnessing something beyond normal sibling rivalry or family discipline. Something had been waiting for this moment, this exact configuration of events. The violence, minor as it was, had created an opening, and whatever had been following me through the dark had seized its opportunity. As the night progressed, reality began to unravel like a poorly sewn garment. The sounds came first, a whipping noise that seemed to slice through the air, followed by an ominous cracking from the woods. When I turned toward the farm pasture, illuminated by the full moon's unforgiving light, I saw it for the first time. The entity that emerged from the tree line defied natural law. It was more absence than presence, a void in the shape of something almost human. But its movement, that terrible fluid motion as it raced toward me, belonged to no earthly creature. I fell back into my chair near the fire, a primal part of my brain recognizing that light and warmth might be my only defense against what approached. The thing stopped directly in front of me, close enough that if it had been human, I would have felt its breath. Its eyes were the only distinct feature, twin points of crimson that seemed to burn with their own internal fire. They held me transfixed, these impossibly red orbs floating in a face made of gathered darkness. The dread that washed over me was physical, like being submerged in ice water. Nobody else around the fire seemed to notice my terror or the impossible thing standing before me. They continued their conversations and laughter, oblivious to the horror unfolding mere feet away. I wanted desperately to alert them, to ask if they could see what I was seeing, but fear of being labeled insane kept me silent. In that moment of paralysis, it spoke again. Follow the shadows. The barn beckoned like a mouth of darkness. When I made my excuse about needing the bathroom, my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. Each step toward the barn felt like moving through deep water, as if reality itself was becoming thicker, more resistant to movement. The pig's squeal as I entered seemed like a warning, a recognition of the wrongness that had followed me inside. The thing that crouched on the beam above me moved like a nightmare given form. Its Spider-Man-like posture was a cruel parody of human movement, as if it had learned about bodies by watching shadows on walls rather than actual people. When it dropped down before me, the absolute silence of its landing was more terrifying than any sound could have been. The impact should have echoed through the barn. Instead, it was as if the thing absorbed all sound, all light, all normalcy. When it extended its hand toward me, what I saw defied comprehension. There, floating above its palm like a twisted puppet, was a perfect miniature version of my friend rendered in pure darkness. His shadow, somehow extracted and condensed into three-dimensional form. The sight of it violated everything I understood about reality, about the fundamental laws that governed our world. The creature's face transformed as I watched, features emerging from the void like a sculpture being carved from absolute darkness. Its yellow teeth gleamed with an impossible light, as if they were catching and reflecting illumination that didn't exist. The smile it gave me was knowing, almost conspiratorial, as if we were now sharing some terrible secret. As it handed me the shadow figure, the barn around us became unstable, reality flickering like a faulty fluorescent light. The darkness seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and the laughter that echoed through the space came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I clutched the small shadow form, its substance feeling both solid and impossibly insubstantial, like holding smoke that had somehow been frozen. The strobe-like effect that followed turned the barn into a nightmare carousel of frozen moments. With each flash, the entity moved closer, its movement not fluid, but rather a series of impossible positions, like a film missing crucial frames. When it reached me, its arctic breath felt like a violation, as if winter itself was trying to crawl inside my body through any opening it could find. The truck ride home became a surreal journey shared with something that shouldn't exist. The shadow sat across from me, its presence both undeniable and impossible. Its gesture for silence felt less like a threat and more like a promise, a pact between us that what had transpired would remain our secret. The headache that pounded through my skull seemed to pulse in rhythm with the entity's very existence. That final visit in my bedroom, where it perched on the edge of my bed like some twisted guardian angel, cemented the reality of what had occurred. Its warning about keeping my friend's shadow safe carried weight beyond the words themselves. It wasn't just a threat, it was an initiation into a world where shadows had substance and darkness had consciousness. The shadow figure still exists, hidden away somewhere in my room like a dark secret waiting to be rediscovered. Sometimes, late at night, I can feel its presence even when I can't see it. A weight in the darkness, a reminder that reality is far more fluid than we pretend. The statue isn't just an object. It's a tether to something beyond normal understanding, a proof that what happened that night wasn't just imagination or stress or the product of an overactive mind. Looking back now, I realize that every element of that night seems orchestrated, as if the entire evening was a carefully arranged series of events leading to that crucial moment. The bike ride through the darkness, the whispers that grew in intensity, the violence between brothers. All of it feels connected in ways I'm only beginning to understand. The entity didn't just happen to be there. It was waiting, perhaps had been waiting long before I ever got on my bike that evening. The most unsettling aspect isn't the creature itself, though its image still haunts my dreams. It's the realization that this thing, whatever it was, operates according to rules and purposes we can't comprehend. It wasn't simply trying to terrify me, it was conducting a transaction of sorts, using me as an unwitting participant in some larger design. The shadow it gave me wasn't just a token or a trophy, it was a responsibility, a burden, perhaps even a test. I've never told my friend about his shadow, about how some part of him now resides in a dark corner of my room. How could I explain that his moment of family conflict somehow created an opening for something ancient and other to reach in and extract a piece of his essence? The weight of this knowledge sits heavy, a constant reminder that the world we think we know is just a thin veneer over something far stranger and more terrible. The entity hasn't returned since that night, but its absence doesn't feel like an ending. Rather, it feels like a pause, as if I'm now living in the space between movements in some vast, incomprehensible symphony. The shadow statue serves as both proof and warning. Proof that what I experienced was real, and warning that reality is far more fragile and permeable than we like to believe. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my room late at night, I find myself fighting the urge to search for the shadow figure. Part of me wants to verify its existence, to reassure myself that I haven't imagined the whole experience. But a deeper, wiser part knows that some things are better left undisturbed. The entity trusted me with this piece of shadow for a reason, and until I understand what that reason is, perhaps it's best to let it rest in darkness. What I encountered that night, demon, spirit, or something else entirely, seemed to exist at the intersection of mischief and malevolence. It was playing games, yes, but games with rules and consequences I couldn't begin to fathom. The fact that it chose to interact with me, to involve me in its mysterious purposes, suggests that there's more to this story than I yet understand. The unknown truly is unknown, as vast and dark as the shadows that entity commanded. We build our lives on the assumption that we understand the rules of reality, that we know where the boundaries lie. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the shadows seem to move of their own accord, I remember those burning red eyes and yellow teeth, and I wonder how many other ancient things are watching us, waiting for just the right moment to reach out and collect what they consider theirs. It was just another ordinary Tuesday when my life took a turn for the extraordinary. I'm John, a regular guy with a desk job at a local insurance company. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. At least, that's what I thought until that fateful night in the swamp. I remember it like it was yesterday. The clock had just struck 9 p.m., and I was packing up my things at the office, ready to head home after a long day of crunching numbers and dealing with clients. As I walked to my beat-up Ford pickup in the parking lot, I weighed my options for the drive home. You see, there's this shortcut I sometimes take through the Cypress Grove swamp. It's not exactly on any map, and most folks in town steer clear of it, especially after dark. But on nights when I'm running late or just too tired to deal with traffic, it's a godsend. Cuts a good 20 minutes off my commute, and I get to avoid that intersection by my apartment where old lady Withers takes about an hour to make a left turn. I know what you're thinking. Driving through a swamp at night? That's some horror movie level stupidity right there. And you'd be right. But hey, we all make mistakes, right? This one just happened to be a doozy. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I made the split-second decision to take the swamp route. It had been raining heavily for the past week, but I figured my trusty pickup could handle a little mud. Boy, was I wrong. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty of what happened that night, let me tell you about Jerry from accounting. Jerry's this weird guy who sits 2 cubicles down from me, always eating these god-awful tuna sandwiches that stink up the whole office. But that's not the strangest thing about him. No, Jerry's got this obsession with the swamp. For months, he'd been going on and on about strange sightings in Cypress Grove. Glowing red eyes in the darkness, unholy screeches echoing through the trees. The usual stuff you'd expect from a guy who spends his lunch breaks brewing suspicious-looking mushroom tea. I never paid much attention to his ramblings. Figured he was just into some wild conspiracy theories, or maybe that tea of his was a little more special than he let on. But as I turned onto the unmarked dirt road leading into the swamp that night, Jerry's words came floating back to me. I brushed them off, of course. I mean, come on. Monsters in the swamp? This isn't some B-grade horror flick. The first few minutes of the drive were uneventful. The heavy canopy of cypress trees blocked out most of the moonlight, leaving me reliant on my headlights to navigate the twisting, muddy path. The usual sounds of the swamp frogs croaking, insects buzzing, provided a familiar backdrop. About 10 minutes in, I noticed something was off. The path I usually took was completely flooded, thanks to all that rain we'd had. Now, any sensible person would have turned back at this point, but me? I decided to push on. There had to be another way through, right? Wrong. So very, very wrong. As I ventured deeper into unfamiliar territory, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Now, swamps aren't known for smelling like a rose garden, but this was different. This was the kind of stench that makes your stomach churn and your eyes water. It was like meat left out in the sun for days, mixed with something, I don't know, almost chemical. My truck started to struggle, the engine sputtering and coughing like it was about to give up the ghost. I patted the dashboard, muttering encouragements under my breath. Come on, old girl, just a little further. That's when it happened. My headlights flickered once, twice, and then died completely, plunging me into total darkness. I slammed my hand against the dashboard in frustration, as if that would magically fix the problem. Spoiler alert, it didn't. I sat there for a moment, trying to get my bearings in the pitch black. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft ticking of my cooling engine and my own ragged breathing. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl right outside my window. Have you ever felt true primal fear? The kind that turns your blood to ice and makes your heart feel like it's trying to punch its way out of your chest? That's what I felt in that moment. I froze, not daring to move a muscle. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. It had to be a feral hog, right? We've got plenty of those in these parts. But deep down, I knew. I knew that no hog I'd ever encountered made a sound like that. The growling intensified, and suddenly something slammed against the driver's side door. The impact was so strong it rocked the entire truck. I couldn't help it. I let out a yelp, my hands fumbling for the door lock, but my fingers were shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle. Another slam against the truck, this time accompanied by the sound of metal groaning under immense pressure. Whatever was out there, it was big and strong, very strong. I groped blindly for my phone, thinking I could use it as a light source or maybe even call for help. But when I finally found it and pressed the power button, nothing happened. The screen flickered feebly for a second, then died. Perfect, just perfect. The next sound I heard nearly made my heart stop. It was the slow, deliberate scraping of claws against metal. The creature, because at this point, I was certain it wasn't any animal I was familiar with, was dragging its claws along the side of my truck. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out any details of what was attacking me. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of a massive silhouette hunched over my hood. It was enormous, easily dwarfing my pickup. In the feeble moonlight that managed to filter through the trees, I could just barely make out leathery skin stretched tight over an oddly shaped frame, a hunched back, and long, gangly limbs that ended in what looked like massive claws. Suddenly, the creature whipped around, and for a split second I swear I saw a pair of eyes glowing red in the darkness. They were like smoldering embers, burning with an otherworldly intensity that sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. But they vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving me to doubt what I'd just witnessed. That moment of doubt was all I needed to kickstart my survival instincts. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to wrestle the truck door open. I stumbled out, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to get away from whatever that thing was. I took off running into the undergrowth, the gnarled branches of cypress trees tearing at my clothes as I pushed through. Behind me, I heard an ear-splitting shriek that sounded like no earthly creature I'd ever encountered. It was followed by the sound of something immense crashing through the trees, in pursuit. I ran blindly through the swamp, my lungs burning, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Thorns ripped at my skin, and roots seemed to reach up from the ground to trip me. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that creature as possible. In my panic, I didn't notice the sudden dip in the terrain. My foot caught on something, a root, a rock, who knows, and I went tumbling down what felt like a muddy incline. I rolled head over heels, unable to stop my descent. My head smacked against something hard, and I tasted blood in my mouth. I came to a stop at the bottom of the incline, lying face down in the muck. For a moment I just lay there, gasping for breath, my whole body aching from the fall. I hoped against hope that I'd managed to lose whatever was chasing me. That hope was short-lived. As I lay there trying to catch my breath and gather my wits, a familiar stench washed over me. That same rotting meat smell from earlier, but stronger now. Close. Too close. Slowly, dreading what I might see, I opened my eyes. What I saw sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through my veins. The creature was right there, its hulking form towering over me. Up close, it was even more horrifying than I could have imagined. Its skin was a sickly gray-green color that seemed to pulse with some sort of internal light. The creature's body was a mass of misshapen lumps and protrusions, as if it had been cobbled together from parts that didn't quite fit. But it was the head, or rather the lack of one, that really got to me. Where a head should have been, there was just a misshapen lump with a gaping maw lined with rows upon rows of razor-sharp teeth. And those eyes, they were back. Two glowing red orbs that seemed to pierce right through to my soul. For a moment we just stared at each other, me, frozen in terror, and this monstrosity from my worst nightmares. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it lunged for me. I let out a guttural scream, raising my arms instinctively in a pathetic attempt to defend myself. I braced for the impact, for the tearing of flesh and the agonizing pain that was sure to follow. The creature's teeth sank into my shoulder, and a blinding pain shot through my body. I cried out, the sound muffled by the thick, fetid air of the swamp. Desperation lent me strength I didn't know I had. I thrashed and kicked, my hands finding purchase on its leathery hide. Somehow, through sheer luck, or maybe just survival instinct, I managed to break free. I scrambled away, leaving a trail of blood on the marshy ground. The creature roared in frustration, a sound that shook the trees around us and sent birds scattering into the night sky. It lunged for me again, but this time I was ready. I rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding its deadly claws. But I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. My limbs felt like lead, my body screaming in protest at every movement. I needed a weapon, anything to even the odds. That's when I saw it. A flicker of movement caught my eye, my old fishing rod. I must have dropped it when I fell down the embankment. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Lurching forward, I snatched up the rod, swinging the clunky metal pole like a makeshift weapon. The creature hissed, taken aback by my sudden offensive. I took advantage of its momentary hesitation to scramble up the muddy embankment I'd fallen down earlier. Reaching the top, I whirled around, expecting the creature to be hot on my heels. But for a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, only the oppressive silence of the swamp. Then that horrible stench filled my nostrils again, and I knew it was close. Suddenly, it erupted from the undergrowth, scrambling up the bank with surprising agility for something so large. I swung the fishing rod blindly, more out of panic than any real strategy. By some miracle, I managed to score a glancing blow against its monstrous head. The creature bellowed and recoiled, but only for a second. I knew the fishing rod wouldn't hold up for long against this beast. I needed something better, something with more heft to it. My eyes darted around frantically, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. They landed on a thick, fallen branch nearby. Adrenaline pumping through my veins, I heaved it up, the weight of it reassuring in my hands. With a scream that was equal parts terror and rage, I charged at the creature, wielding my makeshift spear. I slammed the branch into its shoulder, putting every ounce of strength I had behind the blow. There was a sickening squelch as the pointed end of the branch sank into the creature's flesh, the sound echoing in the night air. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched screech that made my ears ring. It thrashed wildly, trying to dislodge the branch. In its frenzy, the branch snapped, sending me stumbling backward. I lost my footing on the slippery ground and went sprawling onto my back. I looked up to see the creature towering over me, wounded but still very much a threat. A guttural growl built in its throat as it raised a clawed limb, ready to deliver what I was sure would be the killing blow. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end, but instead of the tearing of flesh, I heard something else. A blinding flash erupted behind my closed eyelids, followed by an ear-splitting boom that I recognized as a shotgun blast. My eyes flew open just in time to see the creature recoiling, smoke rising from its hide where the shotgun blast had seared a path. Before I could process what was happening, figures burst from the woods, flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Hold on!" a familiar voice yelled. To my utter disbelief, it was Jerry from accounting. Jerry with his tuna sandwiches and his mushroom tea and his wild stories about monsters in the swamp. Jerry, wielding a shotgun like some kind of action hero. He rushed forward, shotgun raised and ready for another shot. Behind him I recognized two of the local park rangers, their own weapons drawn. The creature, caught in the confusion of the sudden attack and blinded by the flashlights, turned and scrambled back into the darkness. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the dense undergrowth, leaving behind only the lingering stench of rotting meat. Jerry knelt down beside me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and concern. "Holy hell, are you all right?" he asked, giving me a once-over. "I think so," I managed to choke out, though every part of me ached, and I could feel blood trickling from various cuts and scratches. The park rangers quickly assessed my injuries. I had some nasty gashes and bites, but miraculously nothing life-threatening. They patched me up as best they could with the contents of their first aid kit, all the while peppering me with questions about what had happened. The drive out of the swamp passed in a blur of flashing emergency lights and concerned queries. I gave what details I could, describing the monstrous creature with its grotesque form and putrid stench. Jerry and the rangers exchanged worried glances as I spoke, but they nodded understandingly. It wasn't until we were safely out of the swamp and I was being loaded into an ambulance that the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. I had come face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something straight out of a nightmare, and I had survived. The next morning I woke up in a hospital bed, my body a patchwork of bandages and stitches. The local news was already running the story, though thankfully they hadn't released my name yet. The headlines were sensational. "Monster in the Swamp," and "Local Man's Terrifying Encounter with Unknown Creature." By midday, news crews had descended on Cypress Grove Swamp like vultures on a carcass. Police tape blocked off the area where I had my encounter, and a team of investigators combed the scene for evidence. To everyone's surprise, they found plenty. There were massive footprints in the mud, larger than any bear tracks they'd ever seen. Scraps of coarse, unidentifiable fur were found snagged on thorns, and my poor old fishing rod, bent and mangled almost beyond recognition, stood as a testament to the strength of whatever had attacked me. The story quickly became a media sensation. I was interviewed on local news channels and even got a brief spot on some national programs. Skeptics abounded, of course. Many dismissed my story as a hoax or the ravings of a man who'd had too much to drink before driving home. But through it all, there was Jerry. Good old Jerry from accounting, with his stinky tuna sandwiches and his wild theories. He became my unofficial spokesperson, defending me at every turn and backing up my story with his own account of that night in the swamp. Together, we made an unlikely but surprisingly effective team. Jerry's knowledge of local folklore and his tireless research efforts proved invaluable as we tried to make sense of what had happened. After countless hours spent scouring old books and records, Jerry stumbled across an obscure reference in a collection of local Native American folklore. It spoke of a swamp-dwelling demon that had plagued the area centuries ago. The description matched what I had seen almost perfectly, right down to the grotesque appearance and otherworldly stink. In the end, despite extensive searches, they never found the creature. It vanished back into the depths of the swamp, becoming yet another cryptic legend added to our area's already rich folklore. The national media eventually lost interest, but locally, the story of the Cypress Grove swamp monster became something of a sensation. As for me, well, my life changed in ways I never could have anticipated. For one, I don't take shortcuts through those woods anymore. No amount of time saved is worth the risk of encountering that thing again. I've become something of a local celebrity, though not always in a good way. Some folks treat me like a hero, while others think I'm just some attention-seeking liar. But the biggest change? My relationship with Jerry. Who would have thought that the guy I once avoided because of his stinky lunches would end up being the person who saved my life? These days, we're practically inseparable. Those tuna sandwiches, they're not nearly as bad when you're sharing them with a guy who had your back when nobody else did. Jerry's obsession with the swamp and its mysteries hasn't waned. If anything, it's grown stronger. We spend a lot of our free time researching similar incidents around the world, corresponding with cryptozoologists and folklore experts. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever truly understand what happened that night. The experience has left its mark on me, both physically and mentally. I still have nightmares about glowing red eyes and the stench of rotting meat. The scars from the creature's attack serve as a constant reminder of how close I came to death. But they've also taught me an important lesson about keeping an open mind. You see, before all this happened, I was the kind of guy who scoffed at ghost stories and rolled my eyes at tales of the unexplained. Now, well, let's just say I'm a lot more willing to listen, because sometimes the line between myth and reality is a lot thinner than we'd like to believe. So if you're ever driving through our little town and you hear whispers about the Cypress Grove swamp monster, just remember, there might be more truth to those stories than you'd think. And if you see a couple of guys, one with a slight limp and another munching on a tuna sandwich, poring over old books in the local diner, feel free to stop by and say hello. We've always got room for one more believer. As for the creature itself, who knows? Maybe it's still out there lurking in the murky depths of the swamp. Maybe it was a one-time occurrence, a glimpse into a world beyond our understanding. Or maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. One thing's for certain, though, I'll be ready next time. And you can bet Jerry will be right there beside me, tuna sandwich in one hand and shotgun in the other. The maps spread across my living room floor like fallen autumn leaves, their creases worn from countless nights of planning. Spring 2017 loomed ahead of me, a beacon of promise after 2 years of meticulous preparation. Each topographical line represented freedom. Freedom from the suffocating regulations of city life. Freedom to shoot without range masters hovering over my shoulder. Freedom to exist as men were meant to exist. My SKS rifle sat cleaned and oiled on the coffee table, its wooden stock reflecting warm lamplight. I'd spent countless hours practicing with it at regulated ranges, watching range officers flinch at every rapid-fire sequence, enduring suspicious glances from suburban shooters with their plastic fantastic AR-15s. But out there, in the vast expanse of the American West, there would be no one to judge, no one to regulate, no one to fear. The preparation had become an obsession. Every lunch break was spent researching camping spots on federal land. Every evening devoted to watching wilderness survival videos. I'd learned to read weather patterns, to identify edible plants, to track game. My apartment had become a staging area for equipment freeze-dried meals stacked in corners, first aid kits arranged by potential scenarios, ammunition sorted by purpose. My co-workers had started avoiding me. They'd grown tired of my endless talk about bullet trajectories and wind calls, about proper camp setup and predator defense. "You're becoming one of those people," Janet from accounting had said, her voice carrying the same tone she used for discussing conspiracy theorists. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was becoming something else, something that didn't quite fit in the fluorescent-lit world of quarterly reports and water cooler gossip. The night before departure, I made one final check of my equipment. The ritual had become familiar. Ammunition counted and sorted, medical supplies verified, communications devices charged. My satellite phone, an expensive but necessary precaution, showed full bars. The GPS unit contained carefully marked waypoints, each representing a potential campsite or emergency evacuation route. As I worked, a strange sense of foreboding crept over me. The equipment laid out before me seemed suddenly sinister, tools not of recreation but of survival, as if some part of me knew I would need them for more than target practice. I dismissed the feeling as pre-trip jitters, but it lingered like smoke in still air. My contact out west, a local hunter named Marcus, who'd agreed to review my route, had been oddly cryptic in his last email. Things happen out there, he'd written. Things the rangers don't talk about. Stay aware. I'd written it off as typical local mystery mongering, the kind of thing old-timers tell tourists to make their patch of nowhere seem more significant. That night, I dreamed of vast empty spaces and distant gunfire. In the dream, I was running through darkness so complete it felt solid, like black water. Behind me, something pursued, not an animal, but something that moved with purpose, with intelligence. I woke gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, the dream fading but leaving behind a residue of inexplicable dread. Dawn found me loading the last of my gear into my truck. The SKS went behind the seat, carefully wrapped in an old blanket. 6 magazines, each loaded with carefully inspected ammunition, rode in a separate case. The weapon's presence felt talismanic, a bridge between the civilized world I was leaving and the wilder one I sought to enter. The city fell away behind me as I drove west, its towers shrinking in my rearview mirror like sinking ships. Traffic thinned, then disappeared entirely. The landscape opened up, scrubland giving way to high desert, then to the first hints of mountain country. The air changed, becoming clearer, carrying scents of sage and pine instead of exhaust and hot asphalt. With each mile, I felt something inside me uncoiling, some tension I hadn't known I carried releasing its grip. The radio lost signal gradually, voices from civilization fading into static until I switched it off entirely. The silence that followed felt pristine, untouched. I'd chosen my route carefully to avoid major highways, sticking to back roads that wound through landscapes that seemed to exist outside of time. Occasionally, I'd pass through small towns, collections of sun-bleached buildings clustered around single traffic lights. But they felt more like mirages than real places. Marcus waited at the predetermined meeting point, a worn-down gas station marking the edge of civilization. He looked nothing like I'd imagined from our emails, younger, but with eyes that seemed to have witnessed centuries. His ranger-style hat cast a shadow across his face, making his expression unreadable. "You made good time," he said, not as a greeting but an observation. His eyes swept over my truck, lingering on the rifle case visible through the window. "That your only piece?" I nodded, suddenly feeling underprepared. He pulled out the map I'd sent him earlier, its creases now deeper, marked with red ink I didn't remember. "Had to make some adjustments to your route," he said, spreading the map across his truck's hood. "This area here," his finger circled a region I'd planned to explore. "It's not good right now. Strange things happening up there." "Strange how?" I asked, trying to keep the skepticism from my voice. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something in his gaze made my skin crawl. The kind of strange that doesn't make the news, the kind that leaves empty camps and unanswered questions. The wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the empty parking lot. A crow landed on a nearby power line, its black eyes fixed on our meeting with unsettling interest. "Follow this route instead," Marcus continued, tracing a new line across the paper. "Keeps you in radio contact longer. And if you hear shooting—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If you hear shooting, don't investigate. Some questions are better left unasked out here." I wanted to laugh, to dismiss his warnings as local color meant to spook the city boy. But something in his manner, the way his hand trembled slightly as he marked the map, the quick glances he kept throwing at the surrounding hills, stopped me. As I prepared to leave, he grabbed my arm. His grip was iron, surprising strength in those weathered fingers. "One more thing," he said. "If you see lights in the hills at night, any lights at all, break camp. Don't wait for morning. Just go." The crow took flight, its harsh call echoing across the empty landscape like laughter. The first day's hike stripped away my romantic notions of the wilderness. My pack, which had seemed reasonable in my apartment, now felt like it was filled with rocks. The sun beat down with malicious intensity, turning the scattered patches of shade into precious sanctuaries. But as evening approached, bringing with it a blessed coolness, I began to understand what had drawn me here. The silence had texture, depth. No car horns, no sirens, no human sounds at all. Just wind through pine needles and the occasional call of an unseen bird. I made camp in a natural bowl, sheltered by rock formations that resembled sleeping giants in the fading light. The SKS came out of its case like a faithful friend, and I found myself checking and rechecking it as darkness fell. Marcus's warnings echoed in my mind, making harmless shadows seem menacing. That first night under the stars rewrote everything I thought I knew about darkness. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like spilled mercury, more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. My campfire cast dancing shadows on the rocks, creating a small circle of warmth that seemed to float in an ocean of absolute black. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds. Each crack of a branch brought me fully awake, hand reaching for the rifle before consciousness fully returned. Once I could have sworn I heard distant voices carried on the wind, but when I held my breath to listen better, only silence answered. Dawn brought relief and a sense of foolishness. The landscape looked innocent in the morning light, the threatening shadows revealed as harmless bushes and rocks. I broke camp efficiently, eager to reach my planned shooting spot. The dry creek bed seemed perfect, natural backstop, clear lines of sight, no chance of ricochets. I set up my steel targets with the care of someone arranging an altar. The SKS felt alive in my hands, its wooden stock warm despite the cool air. The first shot shattered the wilderness silence like breaking glass. The report echoed off the canyon walls, multiplying until it sounded like an entire squad was firing. The steel target sang back its confirmation of a hit, the sound pure and clean. Time dissolved as I worked through my ammunition, each round a small celebration of freedom. This must have been how the mountain men lived, I thought. This was true independence, true self-reliance. Then the other shots began. At first I thought it was just another echo of my own firing. But the rhythm was wrong, sporadic, urgent. Multiple weapons, their reports overlapping in a way that spoke of either coordination or chaos. Something about the pattern sent ice water through my veins. I'd spent enough time at ranges to know the difference between practice fire and something else. This was something else. The sun was setting when the first scream reached me. I'd retreated to my camp after hearing the distant gunfire, trying to convince myself it was just other recreational shooters. But that sound, that terrible human sound, shattered any comforting illusions I'd built. The scream started as something animal, pure agony translated into sound. Then it transformed, becoming words, a woman's voice crying for help. The words bounced off the canyon walls, multiplying until it seemed like a chorus of terror surrounded my camp. I lay in my tent, every muscle rigid, hand wrapped around my rifle's grip. My mind ran frantic calculations, distance to my truck, number of potential hostiles, chances of successful intervention. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to stay put while something deeper, more primal, urged me to help. Another scream, closer now. Then a single gunshot that seemed to punch a hole in the night itself. The silence that followed was worse than the screams. It was the silence of something terrible finished, of witnesses holding their breath, of predators satisfied with their kill. Hours crawled by like wounded animals. Every sound became a footstep, every shadow a threat. The darkness pressed against my tent like a living thing, testing for weaknesses. My earlier thoughts about mountain men and freedom seemed childish now, the fantasies of someone who had never truly encountered the darkness that humans are capable of. I didn't sleep. Instead, I ran scenarios in my mind, each one ending worse than the last. What if I had investigated the initial gunfire? What if I had tried to help when I heard the screams? What if they found my camp? The questions piled up like stones on my chest, making it hard to breathe. At one point, I heard engines, distant but unmistakable. The sound of vehicles moving through terrain where no vehicles should be. I extinguished my lamp and lay in perfect stillness, listening as the noise grew closer, then faded again. Dawn, when it finally came, felt like a reprieve from execution. I broke camp in record time, abandoning any pretense of leave no trace principles. Every few minutes I would spin around, scanning for pursuit that existed only in my imagination. My rifle, which had felt like such an emblem of freedom the day before, now seemed pathetically inadequate against the horrors I had convinced myself lurked in every shadow. The hike back to my truck became a fever dream of paranoia and self-recrimination. Every rustle in the brush was a potential attacker. Every distant sound another victim I was failing to save. The weight of my pack seemed to increase with each step, as if my cowardice had physical mass. Twice I found fresh tire tracks where none should have been. Once I passed a tree marked with spray paint, some kind of symbol I didn't recognize and didn't stop to study. When I finally reached cell service, my hands shook so badly I could barely operate my phone. The local news sites showed nothing unusual. No reports of missing hikers, no mentions of gunfire in the wilderness. The absence of information felt worse than confirmation would have been. I drove straight to the nearest police station, my story spilling out in a jumbled mess of details and half-formed conclusions. The deputy who took my statement showed neither surprise nor particular interest. His pen moved across the paper with mechanical efficiency, reducing my night of terror to a few sparse lines of text. "We'll look into it," he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Probably target shooters getting rowdy. Happens out there sometimes. But target shooters don't make women scream like that. They don't move vehicles through the wilderness at night. They don't mark trees with mysterious symbols." Months passed before I found the courage to search for answers. The local paper's archives held nothing about my specific night, but they told other stories. Stories of missing hikers, abandoned camps, strange lights in the hills. Most cases were explained away or simply forgotten, but patterns emerged for those willing to see them. Then I found the article. A woman had been abducted by members of an outlaw biker gang, taken to their remote camp for some terrible purpose. She had escaped, been shot, somehow survived. The gang members were caught, made deals, disappeared into the prison system. The location matched, the timing matched. The sounds I had heard had been real. She had lived, no thanks to me. Years have passed, but the weight of that night never leaves me. I carry it like a stone in my chest, a constant reminder that when the moment came to be heroic or even merely decent, I chose safety. The knowledge that the victim survived doesn't lighten this burden. If anything, it makes it heavier, knowing that my help might have spared her some measure of suffering. My guns gather dust now. The wilderness I once romanticized remains beautiful in pictures, but I cannot return to it. Not because I'm afraid of what might happen to me, but because I'm afraid of what I might fail to do again. We tell ourselves stories about who we are, what we would do in a crisis, but the truth only reveals itself in those crucial moments when action or inaction will define us forever. I learned who I was in the darkness of that wilderness night, and the knowledge haunts me still. The modern world makes it easy to distance ourselves from others' suffering. We can look away, turn down the volume, scroll past. But somewhere in the spaces between civilization, people still cry out for help, and sometimes you are the only one who can hear them. To those who believe in staying uninvolved, in minding their own business, I offer my story as a warning. The pain of injury, even death, is temporary. The weight of knowing you failed to help another human being in their moment of desperate need, that is eternal. Put yourself in their shoes. Imagine the terror of crying out into the darkness, hoping against hope that someone will answer. Then imagine knowing that someone heard you and chose to do nothing. That is the weight I carry. That is the lesson I learned in the wilderness. We are all we have in this world. The choice to help or not help may seem monumental in the moment, but I promise you, the choice to do nothing will feel far heavier in the years that follow. Sometimes I dream of that night, but in my dreams, I choose differently. I emerge from my tent, rifle in hand, moving toward those terrible screams. I don't know if I live or die in these dreams. I always wake before the ending. But I wake knowing that in my dreams at least, I chose to be the person I thought I was. The wilderness still calls to others seeking freedom. The stars still wheel overhead, promising adventure and escape. But now I know that true freedom isn't found in the ability to do as you please. It's found in the choice to do what's right, even when everything in you screams to look away. It was the summer of 1959, and the Nevada desert was as unforgiving as ever. The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, creating shimmering mirages on the horizon that teased with false promises of water and respite. In this harsh landscape, I found myself driving a beat-up Chevrolet, its faded blue paint a poor match for the relentless sky above. My name is Douglas Carter, Doug to my friends, if I had any left. Once upon a time, I'd been a promising young man with dreams of making it big in the bustling city of Las Vegas. Now, at 35, I was nothing more than a door-to-door vacuum salesman, peddling dreams of cleanliness to people who could barely afford to put food on their tables. The car's radio crackled with static, occasionally catching snippets of news about the ongoing Cold War tensions or the latest rock and roll sensation. I paid it little mind, focused instead on the dusty road ahead and the gnawing emptiness in my gut. It had been days since my last sale, and the meager commissions were drying up faster than a puddle in this God-forsaken desert. As I approached yet another nameless town, little more than a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled together against the vast expanse of nothing, I couldn't help but wonder how I'd ended up here. Was it the gambling debts, the broken marriage, or just a series of bad decisions that had snowballed into this pitiful existence? The town's welcome sign, if you could call it that, was barely legible beneath years of dust and neglect. "Welcome to Coyote's Rest," it proclaimed half-heartedly. Population, who knows? Who cares? I certainly didn't, but desperation has a way of making a man do things he'd rather not. I pulled up to the first house on the outskirts of town, a ramshackle affair with peeling paint and a porch that sagged like the shoulders of a defeated man. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my sample case from the passenger seat and steeled myself for another rejection. The door creaked open before I could even knock, revealing a weathered face framed by gray hair and deep wrinkles. The old woman eyed me suspiciously, one hand hidden behind the door, likely clutching a shotgun, if my experiences in these parts were anything to go by. "Ma'am," I began, plastering on my best salesman smile, "I'm Douglas Carter, representing the finest in home cleaning technology. Might I interest you in a demonstration of our revolutionary new vacuum cleaner?" She snorted, a sound somewhere between amusement and disgust. "Boy, does this look like the kind of place that needs one of your fancy city contraptions? We sweep our floors with brooms around here, same as we always have." I opened my mouth to argue, to make my pitch about the wonders of modern convenience, but she cut me off with a wave of her hand. "Save your breath, son. Ain't nobody in this town got money for such foolishness. Best move along before you waste any more of your time or ours." The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through my empty stomach. I trudged back to my car, the weight of the sample case seeming to increase with each step. As I tossed it onto the back seat, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. Tired eyes, stubbled cheeks, and a weariness that seemed bone deep. When had I become this hollow shell of a man? I drove through the town's single main street, taking in the sorry sights. A general store with faded advertisements for products that had gone out of fashion years ago. a post office that looked like it hadn't seen a letter in decades. And at the far end, perched on the edge of town like a sentinel guarding the border between civilization and wilderness, stood a lone bar. Its neon sign flickered weakly in the fading daylight, proclaiming itself the Rusty Spur in letters that had seen better days. It was the kind of place that promised cold beer and hot gossip, a refuge for lost souls and weary travelers. In other words, it was exactly what I needed. I pulled into the dusty parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. As I cut the engine, the silence of the desert seemed to press in around me, broken only by the distant cry of a coyote. For a moment I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, wondering if this was rock bottom or if I still had further to fall. With a sigh, I pushed open the car door and stepped out into the sweltering heat. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if I'd been in any mood to appreciate them. Instead, I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, making my way towards the promise of temporary oblivion that lay behind those swinging doors. As I reached for the handle, a gust of wind kicked up, sending a cloud of dust swirling around me. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a shadow flicker at the edge of my vision, something dark and ominous, like the silhouette of a man wearing a wide-brimmed hat. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there but the empty expanse of the desert. Shaking off the strange feeling, I pushed open the door and stepped into the dim interior of the Rusty Spur. The smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hit me like a wall, a familiar comfort that spoke of countless nights spent trying to drink away my troubles. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I took in the sparse decor, a few rickety tables, a jukebox in the corner playing a melancholy country tune, and a long bar stretching along one wall. Behind that bar stood a man who looked like he'd been carved from the very rock of the surrounding mountains. Tall and broad-shouldered, with arms thick as tree trunks and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. He was polishing a glass with a rag that had seen better days, his movements mechanical, as if he'd been performing this same task for eternity. I made my way to the bar, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The bartender's eyes flicked up to me, then back to his task, showing about as much interest as one might in a passing tumbleweed. "What'll it be?" he grunted, not bothering with pleasantries. "Beer," I replied, sliding onto a bar stool that protested my weight with an ominous groan. "Whatever's coldest." He nodded once, setting aside the glass and reaching for a bottle. As he popped the cap and placed it in front of me, I couldn't help but ask, "Say, you wouldn't happen to know anyone in town looking for a top-of-the-line vacuum cleaner, would you?" The bartender's eyebrow raised a fraction of an inch, the most emotion I'd seen from him yet. "Vacuum salesman, huh? Tough break, kid. Folk around here ain't much for modern conveniences. Most still use brooms if they bother to clean at all." I sighed, taking a long pull from my beer. It was lukewarm and tasted vaguely of metal, but it was wet, and that was good enough for now. "Yeah, I'm starting to get that impression. Any other towns nearby that might be more receptive?" He shook his head slowly. "Nearest place of any size is about 100 miles east, and I wouldn't count on them being any more interested in what you're selling. Times are tough all over." I nodded, feeling the weight of my failures pressing down on me. "Well, thanks anyway. Guess I'll just enjoy my beer and be on my way." As I nursed my drink, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The bar wasn't empty. There were a few other patrons scattered about, hunched over their own drinks or engaged in low conversations. But none of them seemed to be paying me any mind. It wasn't until I glanced towards the back of the room that I spotted her. Sitting alone in a darkened booth, a woman who seemed entirely out of place in this dusty, forgotten corner of the world. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with blonde hair that caught what little light there was and seemed to glow. Her face was partially hidden in shadow, but I could make out full lips painted a deep red and eyes that sparkled with something. Interest? Amusement? It was hard to tell from this distance. She must have noticed me staring because she raised her glass in a small salute, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I felt a flutter in my chest, a sensation I hadn't experienced in longer than I cared to admit. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my beer and made my way over to her table. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, trying to summon up some of that charm that had served me so well in my younger days. She gestured to the empty seat across from her with a languid wave of her hand. "Be my guest, stranger. It's not often we get new faces around here." I slid into the booth, noticing as I did so that her dress was of a quality you didn't often see in these parts, silky and form-fitting, more suited to a Vegas showgirl than a small-town bar patron. "Doug Carter," I introduced myself, extending a hand across the table. She took it, her grip surprisingly firm. "Pleasure to meet you, Doug. I'm Veronica Lake." I couldn't help but chuckle. "Like the movie star?" A shadow passed over her face, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Something like that," she said with a wry smile. "So, Doug, what brings you to our little slice of paradise?" I launched into my usual spiel about being a traveling salesman, talking up the virtues of the latest in vacuum technology. But even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow, rehearsed. Veronica listened politely, nodding in all the right places, but I could see in her eyes that she wasn't buying it any more than the rest of the town had. "Sounds like a tough gig," she said when I'd finally run out of steam. "Especially out here. People in these parts tend to be set in their ways." I sighed, taking another swig of my now warm beer. "You're telling me. I haven't made a sale in weeks. Starting to wonder if I shouldn't just pack it in, head back to the city." Veronica leaned forward, her eyes suddenly intense. "And what's waiting for you back there, Doug? A mountain of debt, an ex-wife, or just more disappointment?" I blinked, taken aback by her perceptiveness. "How did you—" She waved a hand dismissively. "Lucky guess. You've got that look about you, a man running from something, even if he doesn't know what it is yet." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the words stuck in my throat, because deep down I knew she was right. I'd been running for so long, I'd forgotten what it was like to stand still. "Tell you what," Veronica said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "How about we get out of here? I know a place not far from town. It's quiet, private. We could talk more freely there." Warning bells should have been going off in my head. This was the kind of offer that led to men waking up in ditches, robbed blind or worse, but something in her eyes, a mixture of promise and danger, had me nodding before I could think better of it. "Sure," I heard myself say. "Lead the way." As we stood to leave, I caught the bartender's eye. He was watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it concern, or something closer to pity? But before I could dwell on it, Veronica had grabbed my hand and was pulling me towards the exit. The night air hit us like a slap to the face as we stepped outside. The temperature had dropped considerably, and a chill wind was blowing in from the east, carrying with it the promise of a storm. In the distance, lightning flickered on the horizon, briefly illuminating the vast emptiness of the desert. "My car's over here," Veronica said, leading me towards a sleek black Cadillac that looked as out of place in this dusty parking lot as she did. "Hope you don't mind if I drive." I shook my head, still trying to process the sudden turn my evening had taken. As we approached the car, that feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the bartender or one of the other patrons following us out. But the parking lot was empty save for my own beat-up Chevy and Veronica's Cadillac. And yet, there, at the edge of the lot, where the light from the bar's neon sign faded into darkness, I could have sworn I saw movement. A shadow, darker than the surrounding night, seemed to detach itself from the gloom. For just a moment, I caught a glimpse of a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. "Doug, you coming?" Veronica's voice snapped me back to reality. I turned to find her already seated behind the wheel, the engine purring to life. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Lack of sleep and too much cheap beer, that's all it was. Had to be. With one last glance at the now empty edge of the parking lot, I climbed into the passenger seat. As we pulled out onto the empty highway, the first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the windshield. Veronica flicked on the wipers, humming softly to herself as she navigated the darkened road with practiced ease. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, still not quite believing my luck. Or was it something else? A nagging doubt began to gnaw at the edges of my mind, whispering that this was all too convenient, too good to be true. "So," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "you never did tell me what brings you to a place like Coyote's Rest. Not exactly a tourist destination." Veronica's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, you know how it is. Sometimes a girl just needs to get away from it all, find herself, or lose herself, whichever comes first." It was a non-answer, and we both knew it. But before I could press further, she suddenly jerked the wheel, sending us skidding onto a narrow dirt road I hadn't even noticed in the darkness. "Shortcut," she explained, though I hadn't asked. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the dirt to mud that sucked at the tires. In the distance, thunder rumbled ominously. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The desert landscape gave way to rocky outcroppings, their jagged silhouettes visible in brief flashes of lightning. Finally, Veronica brought the car to a stop in front of what looked like the entrance to an old mine shaft. "We're here," she announced, killing the engine. I peered out through the rain-streaked windshield, confusion and unease battling for dominance in my gut. And where exactly is here? Veronica turned to face me, and in that moment I saw something in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't malice exactly, but a kind of cold determination that made me suddenly, acutely aware of how isolated we were. "It's a place where people come to make deals, Doug," she said, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain. "A place where a man can change his fortune, if he's willing to pay the price." I reached for the door handle, my instincts screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this woman and this place as possible. But before I could move, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the scene outside the car. And there, standing in front of the mine entrance, was the figure I'd glimpsed earlier. Tall and imposing, rainwater streaming off the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his long coat. As I watched, frozen in terror, he slowly raised his head. In the next flash of lightning, I saw his eyes, and my world shattered. They weren't human eyes at all, but deep, oily pools of blackness that seemed to swallow what little light there was. Veronica's hand clasped my arm, her grip inhumanly strong. "It's time, Doug," she said, her voice no longer that of the alluring woman I'd met in the bar. It had taken on an otherworldly quality, resonating with power that made my bones ache. "He's been waiting for you." I tried to pull away, to open the door, to do anything but sit there, paralyzed by fear. But my body wouldn't respond. It was as if Veronica's touch had turned my muscles to stone. What are you?" I managed to croak out, my voice barely more than a whisper. Veronica's smile was all teeth now, sharp and predatory. "We are the collectors, Doug, the ones who come for souls that are ripe for the taking. And yours, my dear. Yours has been ready for a long, long time." The figure outside the car began to move towards us, each step deliberate and unhurried. He didn't seem to care about the rain that was now coming down in sheets, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. "You see, Doug," Veronica continued, her voice taking on a lecturer's tone, "there are those in this world who are, shall we say, spiritually bankrupt. They've lost their way, their purpose. They drift through life, causing pain to themselves and others, never realizing their true potential. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but deep down, I knew she was right. How long had I been running? How many people had I hurt or disappointed along the way? "That's where we come in," she said, gesturing to herself and the approaching figure. "We offer a choice, a chance to start over, to become something more." The passenger side door opened with a creak, and I found myself face to face with the man in the hat. Up close, I could see that his skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. But it was those eyes that held me transfixed. Bottomless pits that seemed to look right through me, laying bare every secret, every shame I'd ever tried to hide. "Douglas Carter," he said, his voice like gravel being crushed underfoot. "Your soul stands at a crossroads. Will you continue down this path of mediocrity and regret? Or will you embrace a new destiny, one that offers power beyond your wildest dreams?" I felt something break inside me then. All the years of failure, of running from my problems, of blaming everyone but myself, they came crashing down, leaving me hollow and raw. "What? What do I have to do?" I heard myself ask, the words coming unbidden to my lips. The man's mouth stretched into what might have been a smile on a human face. On him it looked like a wound opening. "Simply take my hand and all will be revealed." He extended his arm, palm up, waiting. I stared at it, noticing the elongated fingers ending in sharp black nails that looked more like talons. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight, to do anything but accept this devil's bargain. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered seductively, "What do you have to lose? Your life is already a wreck. Why not take a chance on something extraordinary?" With a shaking hand, I reached out and grasped his palm. His skin was cold, like touching a corpse, and I felt a jolt of something pass between us, a surge of energy that made my heart race and my vision blur. "Excellent choice," the man said, his grip tightening painfully. "Welcome to the family, Douglas. Or should I say, Crow." The world around me began to spin, colors blurring and melting together. I heard Veronica laugh, a sound of pure, wicked delight. And then everything went black. I awoke to the sound of distant thunder, my head pounding as if I'd been on a 3-day bender. As I blinked away the fog of unconsciousness, I realized I was lying on a cold stone floor, the air around me damp and musty. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up to a sitting position and took in my surroundings. I was in what appeared to be a large cavern, dimly lit by flickering torches set into the rough-hewn walls. The space was filled with strange symbols carved into the rock, their edges glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. "Ah, you're awake," a familiar voice said from behind me. I turned to see Veronica emerging from the shadows, her appearance subtly altered. Her skin seemed to shimmer, as if it wasn't quite solid, and her eyes now held the same inky blackness I'd seen in the man's. What happened?" I asked, my voice rasping in my dry throat. "Where am I?" Veronica's laugh echoed off the cavern walls. "You're home, Doug, or at least you will be once your transformation is complete." "Transformation?" I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see them changed into claws or covered in scales, but they looked the same as always, calloused, with a small scar on the right thumb from an accident with a box cutter years ago. "It takes time," Veronica said, as if reading my thoughts. "The physical changes are just the beginning. It's your soul that's truly being remade." As if on cue, a searing pain shot through my chest, causing me to double over in agony. It felt as if something was clawing its way out from inside me, tearing through flesh and bone. "That would be the old Doug dying," Veronica commented casually, watching my writhing with detached interest. "Don't fight it. The more you resist, the more it hurts." I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but no sound would come out. The pain intensified, spreading through my entire body until I was sure I would be consumed by it. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I lay there on the cold stone, panting heavily, my body slick with sweat. But something was different. I felt lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. "Stand up," Veronica commanded. To my surprise, I found myself obeying without hesitation, my body moving with a fluid grace I'd never possessed before. "How do you feel?" she asked, circling me slowly, her eyes raking over my form. I took a moment to consider the question. "I feel powerful," I said finally. And it was true. There was an energy thrumming through me, a sense of potential that I'd never experienced before. Veronica nodded, a satisfied smile playing at her lips. "Good. That's just the beginning. Now it's time for your first lesson." She led me deeper into the cavern, past strange rock formations and bubbling pools of liquid that glowed with an eerie blue light. Finally, we emerged into a larger chamber, where the man in the hat, my mysterious benefactor, stood waiting. "Welcome, Crow," he said, using the name he'd given me earlier. "Are you ready to embrace your new destiny?" I nodded, surprising myself with my eagerness. Whatever doubts or fears I'd had seemed to have burned away in the crucible of my transformation. "Excellent," he said, his black eyes gleaming in the torchlight. "Then let us begin." What followed was a crash course in abilities I never knew existed. I learned to step between shadows as easily as walking through a doorway, to hear the whispers of secrets carried on the wind, to see the threads of fate that bound all living things. But more than that, I learned about the true nature of the world, the hidden forces that shaped reality, the ancient bargains that kept the balance between light and dark. And I learned about my new role as a collector, one of the chosen few tasked with harvesting souls that had strayed too far from their intended paths. Days blended into nights, time losing all meaning in that subterranean realm. I don't know how long I spent there, honing my newfound abilities under the tutelage of the man in the hat, whom I now knew simply as the Master, and Veronica. Finally, after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, the Master declared me ready for my first solo mission. "There's a town not far from here," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "A man there has been causing great harm to those around him, squandering the gifts he was given. It's time for him to face judgment." I nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. This was what I had been reborn to do, to bring balance, to offer choices, to collect what was owed. "Remember," Veronica added, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder, "you're not just taking a soul, you're offering redemption, a chance to start anew. Some will accept as you did. Others, well, their fate is of their own making." With those final words of advice, I stepped into the shadows, allowing them to envelop me. When I emerged, I found myself standing on the outskirts of a small desert town, not unlike the one where my old life had ended and my new one had begun. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A warm breeze carried the scent of sage and dust, stirring memories of a past that already felt like it belonged to someone else. I reached up to adjust the brim of my hat, a fedora much like the Master's, which had appeared on my head the moment I'd left the cavern. My coat, too, seemed to have materialized from the shadows themselves, its dark fabric seeming to absorb the fading light. As I strode towards the town, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a store window. The face that looked back at me was both familiar and strange, my features sharper, my eyes holding a depth that spoke of secrets and power. I smiled, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw the flash of pointed teeth. Time to go to work, I thought, feeling the pulse of corrupted souls calling out to me. The Crow has come to collect. The town of Redemption's End, an irony not lost on me, was like so many others I'd passed through in my former life. A collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled against the vastness of the desert, its inhabitants going about their lives oblivious to the forces that shaped their fates. As I walked down the dusty main street, I could feel the weight of curious stares. A stranger in a small town always drew attention, but there was something more to it now. People's gazes seemed to slide off me, as if their minds couldn't quite grasp what they were seeing. I made my way to the local watering hole, a dingy establishment called The Last Call. It seemed as good a place as any to begin my search. As I pushed through the swinging doors, the buzz of conversation died away, replaced by a tense silence. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a beard that looked like it housed small animals, eyed me warily as I approached. "What'll it be, stranger?" he asked, his hand moving almost imperceptibly towards something beneath the bar. I smiled, allowing just a hint of my true nature to show through. "Information," I said, my voice carrying an echo of power that made the glasses behind him rattle slightly. "I'm looking for a man who's lost his way, one who's been causing pain to those around him." The bartender's eyes widened, and I could see the struggle playing out on his face, the instinct to protect one of his own warring with the primal fear my presence inspired. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but his eyes flicked briefly towards a table in the corner. I turned, following his gaze. There, hunched over a glass of amber liquid, sat a man who radiated an aura of misery and malice. Even from across the room, I could sense the darkness that clung to him like a second skin. As I approached, he looked up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" he snarled, his words slurring slightly. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, ignoring the way the other patrons edged away from our table. "Hello, Frank," I said, the name coming to me unbidden, carried on currents of knowledge I was only beginning to understand. He blinked, confusion momentarily replacing the anger on his face. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," I replied, allowing a hint of a smile to play at my lips. "But I know you, Frank. I know about the wife you beat, the children you've neglected. I know about the money you've stolen, the lives you've ruined with your greed and your rage." Frank's face drained of color, his hand tightening around his glass until I thought it might shatter. "Who the hell are you?" he whispered, fear and defiance warring in his voice. I leaned forward, letting him see the truth in my eyes. "I'm the one who's come to offer you a choice, Frank, a chance to make things right." For a moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, regret perhaps, or a longing for redemption. But it was quickly swallowed by a wave of anger. "I don't know what you're playing at," he growled, "but you'd better get out of here before I show you what happens to nosy strangers in these parts." I sighed, feeling a twinge of disappointment. I'd hoped, perhaps naively, that this first soul would choose the path of redemption. But I could see now that Frank's heart was too far gone, too mired in darkness to accept the chance I was offering. "I'm afraid that's not an option, Frank," I said, standing up. "Your time has come. The only question is whether you'll face your judgment with dignity, or if we'll have to do this the hard way." Frank lunged at me then, his fist swinging in a wild arc. But I was no longer bound by the limitations of my old human form. I stepped aside with preternatural speed, watching as he stumbled past me. "The hard way it is, then," I murmured. What followed was a chaos of breaking glass and overturned tables as Frank, blinded by rage and fear, lashed out at everything around him. The other patrons fled, their screams adding to the cacophony. Through it all, I moved with fluid grace, always just out of reach. I could have ended it at any time, but something in me wanted to give Frank every chance to choose a different path. Finally, cornered and panting, Frank turned to face me. What are you?" he gasped, his eyes wide with terror. I stepped forward, allowing the shadows to swirl around me. I am judgment, Frank. I am the consequence of every choice you've made, every life you've destroyed. As the shadows enveloped us both, I reached out and placed my hand on Frank's chest. I could feel his corrupted soul pulsing beneath my palm, a twisted thing that writhed and fought against my touch. "Your time in this world is over," I said, my voice echoing with power. "But your journey is not yet complete. Where you go from here, that is up to you." With a final desperate cry, Frank's body crumpled to the floor, but in my hand I held a swirling mass of energy, his soul, stripped of its mortal shell. As I stepped back into the shadows, preparing to return to the cavern with my first collected soul, I caught sight of myself in a shattered mirror. My eyes glowed with an inner fire, and for a moment I thought I saw the ghostly outline of wings spreading from my shoulders. I had become something both more and less than human. I was Crow, the collector, the bringer of judgment and the offer of redemption. And this, I realized, was only the beginning. As I emerged from the shadows into the now familiar cavern, the soul of Frank clutched in my spectral grasp. I was met by the approving gazes of the Master and Veronica. "Well done, Crow," the Master said, his black eyes glittering with satisfaction. "You've taken your first step into a larger world." Veronica circled me, her fingers trailing along my shoulders. "I knew you had potential," she purred, "but even I didn't expect you to adapt so quickly." I should have felt pride at their praise, elation at my successful first mission. Instead, I felt hollow. The rush of power that had coursed through me during the confrontation with Frank had faded, leaving behind a gnawing emptiness. "What happens to him now?" I asked, gesturing to the swirling mass of energy that represented Frank's soul. The Master waved his hand, and a shimmering portal appeared in the air beside him. "That is not for you to know, young Crow. Your job is to collect, to offer the choice. What comes after? That is the domain of powers far beyond even us." As he took the soul from me and cast it into the portal, I caught a glimpse of something. A realm of swirling mists and half-formed shapes, echoing with distant cries of anguish and ecstasy. The portal closed before I could make sense of what I'd seen, but the image lingered in my mind, raising questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. "You did well, Crow," Veronica said, her voice pulling me back to the present. "But this was just the beginning. There are many more souls out there waiting for judgment." I nodded, pushing down the unease that threatened to rise within me. This was my purpose now, wasn't it? To bring balance, to offer choices, to collect what was owed. And yet, "Something troubles you," the Master said, his eyes boring into me with unsettling intensity. I hesitated, unsure how to voice the doubts swirling in my mind. "It's just Frank. He didn't choose redemption. He didn't even seem to consider it. What if we're not really giving them a choice at all?" The Master's laugh was like gravel grinding beneath boots. "Oh, Crow, always they have a choice. That some choose poorly. Well, that is the nature of free will, is it not?" I wanted to argue, to point out that Frank had been so consumed by fear and anger that he couldn't possibly have made a rational decision. But I held my tongue, remembering the warnings Veronica had given me about questioning the Master too directly. "Rest now," the Master said, his tone making it clear that the discussion was over. "Tomorrow, we begin your real training." As I retreated to the small alcove that served as my quarters, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, that there was more to this new existence than I was being told. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with strange dreams. I saw faces, hundreds, thousands of them, all wearing expressions of terror and pleading. Among them, I recognized Frank, his eyes now clear of the rage and hatred that had consumed him in life. He reached out to me, his mouth forming words I couldn't hear. I awoke with a start, my heart pounding. The cavern was dark and silent, but I could have sworn I heard whispers echoing off the stone walls, fragments of pleas and accusations. What have I become? I wondered, staring into the darkness. And what price will I ultimately pay for this power? Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. With each soul I collected, my powers grew stronger, my understanding of the hidden world deeper. I learned to move through shadows across vast distances, to hear the thoughts of the living, to see the tangled web of fate that bound all souls. And yet with each mission, the hollowness inside me grew. The faces from my dreams began to haunt my waking hours, their silent accusations weighing on me more heavily than any physical burden. It was during a routine collection in a small Midwestern town that everything changed. The target was a woman named Sarah, a former nurse who had fallen into addiction and begun stealing medication from the hospital where she worked. Her actions had led to patient deaths, marking her as a soul ripe for judgment. I found her in a rundown apartment, huddled on a stained mattress, her body racked with withdrawal. As I approached, shadows swirling around me, she looked up, and I was struck by the clarity in her eyes. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. I knew someone would come eventually." I paused, thrown off balance by her calm acceptance. This wasn't how these confrontations usually went. "You know why I'm here?" I asked. Sarah nodded, a sad smile playing at her cracked lips. "I've done terrible things, unforgivable things. I deserve whatever punishment is coming to me. I should have felt triumph." This was the ideal scenario, a soul acknowledging its misdeeds, ready to face judgment. And yet, what if, I found myself saying, the words coming unbidden to my lips, what if there was another way? A chance to make amends, to set things right? Sarah's eyes widened, a flicker of hope quickly extinguished. "Is that possible, after everything I've done?" In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of offering the usual choice between submission and futile resistance, I reached out and took Sarah's hand. "Come with me," I said, enveloping us both in shadows. We emerged in a small town hundreds of miles away, outside a clinic that specialized in addiction treatment. "This is your second chance," I told her, my voice thick with emotion I didn't fully understand. "Use it wisely." Before she could respond, I stepped back into the shadows, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd just done. When I returned to the cavern, I found the master waiting for me, his black eyes blazing with fury. "What have you done?" he thundered, the very walls of the cavern shaking with his rage. I stood my ground, a strange calm settling over me. "I offered a true choice," I said, "a real chance at redemption." The master's hand shot out, spectral claws wrapping around my throat. "You have violated the most sacred laws of our kind," he hissed. "The balance must be maintained. A soul owed is a soul that must be collected." As I struggled in his grip, I saw Veronica emerge from the shadows, her expression unreadable. "You knew this day would come," she said to the master. "He was always too human." The master's grip loosened slightly, allowing me to gasp out, "What do you mean?" Veronica's laugh was tinged with bitterness. "Oh, Crow, did you really think you were special? That you were chosen? You were just another soul, one that took the easy way out when offered power." The truth hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't a chosen one, imbued with divine purpose. I was just another link in a chain of corruption, perpetuating a cycle of pain and false choices. "No," I said, newfound strength flowing through me. "I won't be part of this anymore." I summoned every ounce of power I'd accumulated over the months, feeling it surge through my body. The shadows around me writhed and pulsed, responding to my will in a way they never had before. The master's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in determination. "You think you can defy us? We made you what you are?" "No," I growled, feeling my form shift and change, black feathers sprouting from my skin. I made myself. What followed was a battle that shook the very foundations of the underground realm. Shadow clashed against shadow, spectral energy crackling through the air. I fought with everything I had, driven by the faces of all those I'd condemned, all those I'd failed to truly help. In the end, it was Veronica who turned the tide. As the master prepared to strike a killing blow, she stepped between us, her own shadows merging with mine. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying a power I'd never heard before. "It's time for a change." The master howled in rage and disbelief, but it was too late. The combined force of our power overwhelmed him, reducing him to a swirling mass of formless energy. As the echoes of battle faded, I turned to Veronica, questions burning in my eyes. She smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "I've been waiting centuries for someone like you, Crow. Someone who could see beyond the rigid laws we've clung to for so long." "What happens now?" I asked, feeling the weight of possibility pressing down on me. Veronica gestured to the cavern around us, to the portals that led to countless mortal realms. "Now we remake the system. We offer true redemption, true choices. It won't be easy, and there will be consequences we can't foresee. But it's time for a new way." As I stood there, my form still flickering between human and something other, I felt a sense of purpose flood through me. This was why I'd been brought into this world, not to blindly follow, but to challenge, to change, to evolve. "Where do we start?" I asked, spreading wings I was only now learning to control. Veronica's smile was both beautiful and terrible to behold. "We start with the truth, Crow. We go back to every soul you've collected, every life you've touched. We offer them a real choice, a real chance." I nodded, understanding the monumental task ahead of us. It wouldn't be easy. There would be those who resisted, who clung to the old ways. But for the first time since I'd taken the master's hand in that rain-soaked parking lot, I felt truly alive. As Veronica and I stepped into the shadows, preparing to reshape the very nature of cosmic justice, I spared a thought for Douglas Carter, the failed vacuum salesman whose desperate choice had set all of this in motion. "I hope you can forgive me," I thought, "for what I've done, and for what I'm about to do." Then we were gone, venturing into a future as uncertain as it was full of promise. Years passed in the mortal realm, though time held little meaning for beings like us. Veronica and I traveled between worlds, unraveling the complex web of souls and choices that the old system had created. We faced resistance, of course. Other collectors, beings who had grown comfortable with the old order, tried to stop us. But with each soul we freed, each life we touched, our power grew. We didn't offer easy redemption. That would have been another form of false choice. Instead, we created opportunities for genuine growth, for sincere atonement. Some souls embraced the chance, working tirelessly to right their past wrongs. Others rejected it, choosing to remain mired in their darkness. But always there was a choice, a real choice. I never forgot Sarah, the nurse whose quiet acceptance had sparked this revolution. We found her again, years later, working at that same clinic where I'd left her. She had dedicated her life to helping others overcome their addictions, turning her past mistakes into a source of empathy and understanding. When she saw me, there was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet recognition. "I always hoped you were real," she said, a smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "That I hadn't imagined you." I shook my head, marveling at the strength of the human spirit. "You didn't imagine me, Sarah, but you saved yourself. I just opened a door." As for me, I was no longer simply Crow, the collector. I had become something new, a being that straddled the line between mortal and divine. My wings, now a permanent feature, were a reminder of how far I'd come from that desperate vacuum salesman in a Nevada desert town. Veronica remained by my side, her own nature evolving as we reshaped the cosmic order. We were partners, equals in our mission to bring true balance to the universe. But even as we worked to right the wrongs of the past, new challenges arose. The fabric of reality, it seemed, was not meant to be static. As we changed the rules, new complications emerged. Unforeseen consequences of our actions that threatened the very balance we sought to create. And so our work continued, an eternal dance of correction and adaptation. We had started down a path with no end in sight, but I wouldn't have had it any other way. For in the end, isn't that what life and what comes after is all about? The constant struggle to grow, to improve, to make better choices. As I stand now, looking out over a sea of souls, some bright with hope, others still shadowed by doubt, I think back to that rainy night when a desperate man took a devil's bargain. I think of all the mistakes I've made, and all the chances I've had to make things right. And I know, with a certainty that resonates through every fiber of my being, that the choice to change, to strive for something better, is the most powerful force in all of existence. So to all those souls out there, struggling with their own demons, fighting their own battles, I say this: your story isn't over. Your choices still matter. And somewhere out there in the vastness of eternity, there's a being with black wings and eyes that have seen too much, rooting for you to find your way. Choose wisely, choose well, but above all, never stop choosing.